I'll give a quick recap for those who are visiting with us, or if you missed the first one, don't remember. We started getting into early church of what happened when Jesus Christ was here, and started right after he was crucified, and the early church. But we were given a lot of back history of what was going on at that time, trying to get some of the social concepts of what they were dealing with, what the time would have been like, why there was so much confusion, which we'll talk about some of that today, of why there's so many misconceptions or what some of the struggles were. We mentioned last time talking about, it would have been nice to be there right at that time, because just after Christ was walking the earth, it would have been great because everything would have been perfect. He would have had everything organized and set up, and the reality of it, it wasn't that way. And we'll get into a little bit today of why that was. Basically, one of the main things we did last time was talk about a couple of the main figures at that time that kind of had a big impact. Philo was one of them. If you remember Philo, he was the Jewish philosopher that lived in Alexandria, Egypt at that time, who wrote a massive book that kind of took the Greek philosophy and blended that with the Bible. What he ended up coming up with was that the majority of the Bible was allegory, where we believe the Bible's majority is truth and actually happened with a tiny bit of allegory. It kind of changes the whole perspective. When you think about Jonah being swallowed by a big fish, and the Red Sea parting, all of those things for him would have been just stories. It would have been made up just to make a point. For us, we think we know those things happen, right? They walked across on dry ground. And so he had a big impact at that time because of where he lived and what he was doing. We also talked about Flavius Josephus. He was the one that wrote the Jewish War and the Jewish Antiquities. He was the one that was the kind of a commander of the army at that time. He was taken captive in 67 AD by the Roman Empire, and that's why the Jews kind of have this, some of them still like him, some of them viewed him as a traitor. They were just following this rabbi. They were following this one person. They were trying to dress like him, talk like him, act like him, remember the things he did. And so that kind of creates this dynamic of society at that time of what they were going through. And that really leads us to understanding a lot about what happened at this point in time. The Jews relied very heavily on two things: the Torah, right, God's law, and then they had oral law. The Jews had this oral law, which was kind of this battling back and forth of all these rabbis. If they had something that they wanted If they had trying to figure out what they should do or what belief they should have, they would have a rabbi who would make a claim, and then all these people would discuss it. They would start talking about it, and so they not only imitated him, but they were learning from them. They were trying to get all of the knowledge that they had. And so we have these battles back and forth where they go, well, Rabbi so-and-so said this 300 years ago. And they go, well, Rabbi so-and-so said this. And so they go back and forth with these arguments about what the Jewish law is, what was the standard. And what we end up getting now, we have, I believe it's 38 volumes. It's called the Talmud. It's basically the arguments. It's all of these arguments because eventually it shifted from being just oral debates, oral discussions, and they actually started writing them all down. It's amount of information now how they govern their lives. If you remember, this is all going back to a protection. It's a protection of God's law. That's why they created all these oral arguments and these oral laws, was because they never wanted to go back into captivity. Their whole idea was that if we can make enough laws to protect God's law, we'll never be taken into captivity again. And so that's kind of the basis of this oral law, that they have the Torah, and then they have the oral law. And the oral law was designed to protect God's law, protect the Torah, so that they never crossed that line to be able to break God's law. And so that's why we're looking at this early church history and see why there was so much confusion, why there were so many different rules, and why there were these different mindsets of what people were doing and how they do it. Oftentimes we forget about that. We think, well, they should have had all this information. Well, when we look at this, we're talking about first, second, third, fourth century people. There was a lot of stuff that they did not have. A lot of materials that they didn't have that we do. For them, all they had was recognizing Old Testament. They had the Old Testament stuff. The New Testament wasn't written at this point. And so when they think about what they transitioned through, being taken into captivity by Babylon, and then the Persians releasing them, going through the Greek empires, they're now under the Roman Empire. What happened during all this time frame was something called the diaspora. Anybody know what the diaspora is? The dispersion. It was the dispersion of basically the Jewish people. They were no longer confined to just Babylon. When the Persians released them, some of them went back home, right, to reestablish the temple, to get everything reset back up. But at the same time, a lot of these Jews traveled elsewhere. They went out in other parts of the empire, whether what we know today is the Greek or the Persian or the Roman Empire. They spread out. They headed all over the place. They didn't all go back home. And what ended up happening, instead of going back to an agrarian society focusing on agriculture, when they set up these new little cities, they became more focused on becoming major players as merchants and bankers, and that's how they founded these cities. They became very wealthy doing that. And so that was kind of the core of their towns. They'd create these communities. And what happens is, as the communities would grow, as they get more people, the community would get big enough, once they established themselves, they would build a synagogue. Now, the synagogue was their focus of their people, right? That's where they went to pray. It's where they went to learn. It's kind of their community center, the hub of what they were going to be doing. And it's basically our church building today. Right? This is where we come together to fellowship, to focus on God, to have that relationship. We like to do activities, right? We're having the teen lock-in here tonight. That was their focus for their day, similar to what we have as our church buildings today. And so as they go through this, once they get that synagogue built, they would send off and ask for a rabbi to be sent, because they wanted somebody to come and teach them. They wanted to find out what they were supposed to be doing. They wanted somebody to read the Holy Scriptures to them. And so they would ask for these rabbis to come and sit in that synagogue and fulfill that role. And there's a lot of stuff that went on, a lot of different community aspects of what they dealt with and what they went through. And so as they're going through, we see some issues that arise, because the real problem that we find in the second and third centuries is people couldn't afford Bibles. It was ridiculously expensive for them to have individual Bibles. And that's what's hard for us to recognize sometimes, is because we walk around with it in our pocket. Not just the Bible. I have 40 different translations of the Bible. I have Greek and Hebrew. I've got commentaries. I've got probably 2 or 3 different apps that'll do an interlinear, that would do a dictionary, right? I can have probably any number of commentaries that I want as well. They didn't have the access to it because it was extremely expensive to have it, and they didn't have the ability to manufacture books like we do today. And so we have this challenge that they were dealing with, that they go through, that they not only didn't have a lot of them, in their synagogues, oftentimes they only had fragments of the Bible. So they didn't even have the Old Testament or the entire Torah. They would only have bits and pieces of it. And so that kind of created some of this problem with them having a consistency between all of the groups and all of the churches and all the areas, is because they didn't all have the information. They only had part of a Bible, and so their viewpoint oftentimes would be skewed. That's what we see in that early 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries as the early church was being created. These fragments is all they had to focus. That's why we see the apostles hopping around so much. They were traveling from church to church to church to church. Why? To teach them about God's law, right? To teach them what they were doing right and what they were doing wrong. We see the letter to the church at Corinth. The first Corinthians is very different than 2 Corinthians, right? Because the first one he's going, hang on, you guys are a mess. It's a wreck. And then second, he's going, okay, you guys figured a lot of this out. He goes, I wasn't trying to be mean, but we got to get you straightened out. And so we see a lot of this confusion is just because of the availability. There was no mass producing, you stick it in a printer or a copy machine and it produces it for you. There was a lengthy process that they had to go through, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But when you think about the viewpoint of having these fragments and what the Jews were trying to do and what Christianity was trying to do, the Jews at this point were all still focused on protecting God's law, making sure not to break any of his commandments. And so what they do is, by these traditions, they would set the barrier way before the actual law. It wasn't getting to God's law, but they set these barriers so that they would never break it. What that would mean is, okay, if we talk about committing adultery, you first have to, see somebody, right, to start having those relationships. So you look in the Jewish community, what they ended up discussing was, all right, we'll cover women head to toe. Won't even be able to see them. You completely cover them. Now, they never actually got that far. They never actually put that in. But we look at some other religions that are still active today who practice that, right? There's still the same idea of if we can't see each other, we don't infringe on those laws. But what we do see, they still did take extremes at times. And so what they did at that point, even still today in some Orthodox synagogues, you'll see that the men and women don't sit together. They separate. Because if you can't see each other, you can't have lustful thoughts about each other. And so they go through this. When we think about the time frame, the age here, teenagers, the young ladies, 13, 14, 15, 16, would have been getting ready to marry off at 17, 18, 19-year-old, right? One of the younger guys getting ready. And so they would separate them, men and women. You can't see each other, all with the basis that we don't want to commit adultery. And we look at this and go, well, how does those two play hand in hand? And it was, we don't ever want to even get close to breaking that law because we don't want to go back into captivity. And so they put their fence way up in front of God's law. They started protecting it. They put these barriers up. This was their oral law. This was their justification, their ideas, how to make sure that nobody committed adultery. To make sure, and they go through lots of different hoops like that. Up in Fort Wayne, when I was giving this last week, something came up talking about the meats and cheeses, right? You can't boil a goat in its mother's milk. They had two completely separate kitchens. They never crossed those two things because they never wanted to infringe on God's law. They put these barriers, they did these things in order to say, we never want to go into captivity. Breaking God's law is what had them taken into captivity, and so they did everything that they possibly could to avoid going back there. And it started out with all these oral discussions. Anybody remember playing telephone game in school? I imagine everybody. What happens by the end? It makes no sense from what it was in the beginning, right? Not even close. It took like 5 people. Now, sometimes they did it on purpose, which I wouldn't be surprised if sometimes the rabbis did it on purpose, right? We have an agenda sometimes. We go, I'm going to tweak this a little bit. And then you pass that on and spread it, and it changes and changes and changes. And it was always funny to hear what comes at the end of it. That's kind of what this oral law, that was what would happen. Now, it could be one of the problems that would pop up is that it slightly changed. But that's why they started writing it down, and we have all those volumes of the Talmud. All based around this ideology that they didn't want to break God's law. They wanted to protect themselves, and this was the only way they knew how to do it. So thinking about books and thinking about all of these writings, if you think back to 200 BC, how many books were written? None. There were no books at that time, right? Books hadn't quite been invented. What were they? Scrolls, yeah. Anybody know what name was usually associated with those scrolls? What were they usually called? Nah, the scribes were ones that wrote them. Codices, right? That's what these scrolls were. There was no mass printing of these scrolls. And that's where these scribes come in play. The scribes had a massive role because it wasn't easy to replicate these. It took somebody with a second scroll, ink, quill, and they sat down and they matched it up and they copied it letter for letter. And they copied it and they copied it and they copied it. And so it became this profession. They had professional people with skill sets to be able to sit down and do this. Because after some amount of time, right? So we have all these synagogues spread out all over. And if you only have part of it, what would you do to get another part? You have to ask for somebody, right? Sometimes they swap scrolls. They go, okay, I got this part. We need that part. And so as these scrolls transfer, they wear out. And so we needed scribes in order to replicate these. The issue is that none of us are perfect, even these scribes as good as they were. So every time they would be writing, if they messed up a letter or messed up a word or added a word or forgot a word, they'd have to make a note at the bottom. Or my ink blotted here, it's not anything I'm crossing out. They were constantly noting, okay, this is what's going on, this is why this is here, this is why it says this. And so these scribes were designed specifically to copy and copy and copy whenever these were wearing out. And so when we think about all of this protection of God's word and all of this protection of God's law, there's a big thing that goes into play when we're talking about how this is written out, because nobody ever wanted to mess up God's name. And so what they wrote, instead of writing out God's name, they wrote the Tetragrammaton, the YHVH or YHWH. And so if we're thinking about all of these oral laws, what would make sense as to why they would do that? Do we have a commandment from God that kind of correlates to messing up his name? Don't take his name in vain. Right. In order not to take his name in vain, they refused to ever speak his name or write his name. That was the whole mindset behind it. We want to protect the law, so we will make a law to where we can't even break it. And so they would never write it, they would never say it. And so when we have these discussions of how do you pronounce the YHVH, how do you pronounce God's name, if you went to a Jew today and asked them, they'd go, I can't tell you. We don't know. That argument is an English argument. That's an English argument of what is God's name? How do you pronounce it? Because they refuse to do it, because they refuse to break God's law. That's one of their oral laws that they've put as a hedge around the truth, around God's words. And so we start to see the mentality and the society that they were living in. And it makes a lot more sense when we look at, in the Bible, we see all these sections where Christ is approached by scribes and Pharisees, right? So he's always having these debates and these arguments. Goes back to their oral discussions. And they're having these debates to where something comes up and they need to find information out of the book of Isaiah. That's why the scribes were there. Their job was to write over and over and over again. They'd have a scribe that wrote the book of Isaiah. So that when they go, hey, what does Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 11 say? There were no chapters. There were no verses, right? They didn't exist. It was one scroll. And so they'd just have to either jump to the middle part or the end part. And they would have these memorized from going over and over and over again. And so that's why we see the scribes referred to so many times. They were the ones that were going, hey, what does it actually say? You wrote it 10,000 times. What does it say? They were the ones that had this memorized oftentimes. But I find it interesting because it makes a lot more sense when we see how Christ rebuttals a lot of these. Christ was accused multiple times of breaking the Sabbath and doing things like that. When he was being addressed, he oftentimes ignored the argument that they had and he would jump straight to God's law. Why would he do that? Because their oral law wasn't God's law. He's going, hang on, I didn't break this law. And so that's why they never had anything to say to him, is because he wasn't actually breaking God's law. And he was going, no, you're not understanding this. And so every time, they all just kind of fizzled out, right? They were never able to pin him down because he knew the scriptures and he knew what was expected by God the Father. And so we go through this process and we see how these arguments play out. And when we read some of these arguments, it's interesting to see how he breaks down the scripture and what his focus is. In the Jewish world, Ezra is considered the greatest scribe because in the Bible, he's referred to as Ezra the scribe. So they believe that he was a prophet and the greatest scribe that existed. And so we have all of these arguments. We have these groups of people gathering together. As they develop these rules, as they develop this oral law that they use to protect themselves, this is where it was shortly after the Babylonian captivity. The people we know in the Bible as the Pharisees, they were known as the fathers. And they were the ones that started coming up with these oral laws, these oral traditions that they passed on, these arguments. That was the group of people that really were these front runners as Pharisees to try to protect God's law, put that hedge around it. Head over to Galatians chapter 1 and then verse 13. This is the world of the first century, the church here at this time. When Jesus comes along and starts teaching, and this is the kind of the society that we find this setting in. It's a world that's built not solely on God's laws, but this protection of his laws, this hedge. And so when we think about the Jews and their ideas of trying to protect themselves, of not going into captivity, at that time of Christ, what happened? They weren't in captivity the same way they were in Babylon, but they were still under captivity, right? Who were they under? Romans, yeah. They had to pay taxes. They couldn't rule themselves. They had Roman governors who were kind of over the majority of a region, and so they were never fully allowed to rule themselves. And so it wasn't captivity as they were slaves, but they were still in captivity. And now for them at this point, this starts to really change because they knew the Old Testament. They knew the prophecies of Daniel where it talks about the four empires. They know they went through Babylon, they went through the Greeks, and they went through Persians, and then now we're at the Romans. And so for them, they start looking at their situation, and their conclusion is Well, the Messiah's coming. They go, we're under captivity, we're under Roman rule, so the Messiah has to be coming. So this was their mentality as they get into it. When we look at society right now, they were looking for a Messiah. They were looking for this ruler to be coming, because even though it wasn't the Babylon captivity, they still viewed themselves as captives. That's why they revolted so many times. And so here in Galatians chapter 1, if you look at verses 13 and 14, this is what Paul writes here. He says, "For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it." And verse 14, "And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers." So he says, as I persecuted the church, right? He's owning up to his mistakes. He goes, I was really harsh. He goes, I outdid all of the other students around me. We know he was well educated. Paul was one of the most difficult people to understand in the Bible in some of his writings. Even Peter says it's confusing the way he writes. It's because I think he was probably one of the most intelligent people. Right? He was extremely well educated. He knew Greek philosophy. He knew Hebrew. He knew all of the Judaic laws. He knew what he was talking about, and so he was living by that. But there at the end, he says, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. That was that oral law. That wasn't the Ten Commandments. That wasn't God's laws. He's going, these are the traditions that have been passed down. That's what he had learned in all of his education. And he goes, that's what I was basing this all on. That was the foundation of why I was persecuting people. And so it kind of changes the viewpoint when we look at why the Jews acted the way they did, why they had some of the struggles that they did with accepting Christ and some of the things that he was doing, and why they were so harsh on Christianity at that early time. Now, there are people who have tried to debate that that's talking about the Ten Commandments, that's talking about the law of God, but he never would have written it that way. The law of God is not the traditions of my fathers. It's God's law. It was God's. So these were the types of arguments that they had. This is what they would have been going through of how to interpret the law, how to abide by the Sabbath. Right? We look at some of what they do, what they still do today, not being able to walk a certain distance, not being able to start fires, not being able to turn on light switches. We still see a form of this today with them trying to uphold this oral law, to still not break God's law. It's that protection, it's that barrier. And so that's where we find ourselves. At any point, if anybody has questions, feel free to jump in. I normally say that at the beginning. I forgot we had a lot of extra people today. Feel free to raise hands or just cut me off if you have any questions. Anybody have questions or comments up to this point? Yeah, Don.
Where did the Pharisees get their authority?
Where did they get their authority? Well, I mean, that stems all the way back. So there's the line. There's still the Judaic line, right? The line of Judah that they, with the Levitical priesthood, that they still abide by. It still exists today. That the Levitical priesthood is still inactive today. They're waiting on having a perfect heifer, and they're waiting on having a new altar. They have a lot of the utensils already, so that never went away. They still have that basis of sacrifices. They still had a high priest. The only thing is, basically, because of the Roman rule, they would put who they wanted in charge of high priest, and it ended up they had multiple high priests at one time. And so they kind of got away from God's specific law. And so that goes back with the tradition all the way back. Any other questions at this point? Yeah, it becomes real muddy, right? When we start adding laws on top of laws just to protect the law, it becomes a challenge. It becomes hard. God specifically said, it's not supposed to be a challenge. It's not supposed to be complicated. And Christ said, my burden is light. My yoke is light. Because the law of God is supposed to be pleasant. It's supposed to be enjoyable. It's not supposed to be laborsome. It's not supposed to be cumbersome. He designed it so that it brings out good things. And so this is the society that the early church is coming up in. This is where it's developing out of. And so I want to hit on just a little bit of, sometimes people talk about why when Christ came as the Messiah, we see quite a few people jumping on board with that. Right? The Pharisees and the Sadducees fought it because he was putting himself on equal with God. But think about the time when he rode into town on the donkey. What happened? Did he get rocks thrown at him and fruit? And what happened? They were celebrating, right? He's marching through town. They're throwing down branches and they're celebrating. Why? Because they were waiting on a Messiah. They were waiting on a Messiah. They knew they were to that fourth empire. They knew they were under the Roman rule, and they're going, well, this is our guy. The problem is, it happened multiple times. Anytime there was some type of rebellion or revolt after Christ, anybody who looked like they were coming of power, they're supporting these people. They're going, oh, this must be the Messiah. This must be that ruler. Their Messiah was very different from the Messiah that we recognize, because they didn't have the New Testament. Yeah, Sue? Yeah. All of those are branches, extensions of it. Every other commandment hangs on those two. When we look at the 10 Commandments, the first 4 are all focused on loving God. And the last 4 are all how we love each other, right? And so when we look at those, did I say last 4? We only have 8 commandments now? No, the last 6, there's still 2 more in there. The last 6, you get one thing in your head and it just blurts out. So I got you guys to catch me. So those last 6 are all focused on us, how we love each other. We're not going to do some of those things because it damages our relationships. It creates barriers. Yeah, and that's not throwing the law out at all. May have been the last sermon where I talked about, without. A lot of people say the law was fulfilled or the law was thrown out. If that is true, then that means for the last 2,000 years there's been 0 sin. It makes no sense because it also says every single one of us has sinned. And so the law can't be thrown out. That law is what teaches us what sin is. So, yeah, it's amazing how he's purposeful with everything he does. Yeah. And so they're looking for They're looking for this ruler. What was their ruler that they had in mind? It's a coming king, right? What was he supposed to do? Reestablish them, right? Get rid of all the other nations that were ruling over them, and they were to be the nation. He was supposed to be their ruler. He was supposed to be this dominating king. They didn't have the New Testament. What does the New Testament teach us? What does 2 Thessalonians and Revelation teach us? There's 2 comings, right? There's 2 separate comings. So what they had trouble with, they find sections like Isaiah 2 where they're going, this king, this ruler is supposed to come. They didn't know how to blend that with things like Isaiah 52. Actually, let's go over there. It's interesting to read because this is what they had. This created some controversy and division. Isaiah 52 and 53, it talks about a different type of ruler. And so they get a little bit of confusion because they know they're in that fourth empire. They know they're waiting on this ruler, but they don't understand exactly what he's supposed to look like. Let's see. See how much of this I want to read. Let's pick it up. Let's start in verse 7. So this is Isaiah 52 and verse 7, and then we'll read some of 53 as well. It says, "How beautiful upon the mountain are the feet of him who brings good news, who proclaims peace, who brings glad tidings of good things, who proclaims salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Your watchmen shall lift up their voices, with their voices they shall sing together, for they shall see eye to eye when the Lord brings back Zion. Break forth into joy, sing together, you waste places of Jerusalem, for your Lord has comforted his people, he has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all nations. And all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. Depart, depart, go out from there. Touch no unclean thing, go out from the midst of her, be clean. You who bear the vessels of the Lord, for you shall not go out with haste, nor go by flight, for the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently, he shall be exalted and extolled and be very high, just as many were astonished at you. So his visage and marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sparkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths at him, for what he had not been told them they shall see, and what they had not heard they shall consider. And then chapter 53, it says, who has believed our report, and to whom the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief, and he hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid him the iniquity of us all." That's a very different character than a mighty king and ruler that they were expecting to come. And so they have difficulties. Some of the ideas were that they are actually two different messiahs. One was going to be a sacrifice, and the other one was going to be that king and that ruler. They didn't have the rest of the story like we do. They didn't see the rest where he's going to return. As the first fruit, he's going to come and create the rest of the first fruits. They didn't have all of that information. And so this is some of the turmoil, and this is some of the confusion that they had of waiting for this Messiah. And as I said, after Christ, every single one of these little revolts and these rebellions that popped up, people were watching going, okay, are you the king that's going to overthrow Rome? And so you see these little incursions pop up and these revolts to take place, but they always got crushed. They always got crushed at some point. So this is why it's such a hotbed. This whole area seems to be a hotbed because they're waiting for a ruler. They're anticipating a ruler, a king to overthrow Rome, but he's just not coming yet. He's just not coming. They don't know why, because they know that he's supposed to. They know that they're in that time frame. And 2,000 years later, they're still waiting for that Messiah. They just keep looking in the wrong spot, right? They haven't accepted Christ as the Messiah. They haven't pieced together all of it. God hasn't opened their eyes to figure that out. And so that's what we deal with. And so I'll stop there. The teens, I imagine, should be done pretty quick. But hopefully that starts to lay a good basis of why we see so much confusion, what society was like at that time, and why there was so many issues with the early Christian church, what they were battling and what they were going through. I'll go ahead and give you this, actually. I'll start with this next time, too. But thinking about that oral law, this is something that Philo wrote. This is one of his quotes. It's kind of puts you in that mentality of how highly they valued the oral law. It says, "For the man who obeys the written laws is not justly entitled to any praise, inasmuch as he's influenced by compulsion and the fear of punishment." So he's basically saying anybody can keep the Ten Commandments. He goes, Gentiles can do that. And then he says, But he who abides by the unwritten laws is worthy of praise as exhibiting a spontaneous and constrained virtue. That's how much they viewed that oral law. It was special. It was a special thing to do the oral law, not so much to just keep God's law. And so that puts a different emphasis on where their mind was and where their focus was. I'll read that again next time, but that's where we'll pick this up. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email them, text them, grab me, whatever.